Story 1. You can download most of Osama bin Laden's hard drive from the Central Intelligence Agency's website. It includes a fair number of licensed movies, anime, games, and similar content. All of this is free for anyone who wants to access it. Story 2. Project Azorian was a Central Intelligence Agency operation to retrieve the remains of the Soviet Golf-class ballistic missile submarine K-129. It sank in the North Pacific while on patrol, resting on the seafloor about 3 miles down. The Central Intelligence Agency and Department of Defense believed that a salvage operation had the potential to retrieve nuclear submarine-launched ballistic missiles, nuclear torpedoes, code books, and cryptographic gear from the wreck. However, the Soviets often patrolled the spot to prevent the Americans from doing exactly that. The Central Intelligence Agency was ordered by Henry Kissinger to collaborate with Howard Hughes to set up a false flag deep-sea mining concern, which involved the construction of a large purpose-built ship called the United States naval ship Hughes Glomar Explorer. It had the appearance of a deep-sea mining vessel, but concealed inside was an enormous moon pool with a giant claw that would be lowered to grab the wreck and pull it up to the surface. Allegedly, they did snag the wreck, but the claw suffered a malfunction halfway up, causing a portion of the hull to fall back to the seafloor. The details of the portion of the hull that was actually recovered and what exactly was found have never been officially disclosed. Kissinger authorized a second attempt, but before that could be effected, the Los Angeles Times broke a story about the operation, allegedly sourced from a memo that was part of a cache of documents that was stolen from a Hughes office some months prior. With the operation now fully exposed, the Soviet Navy stationed destroyers at the spot to prevent the Americans from trying again, and Kissinger finally canceled any plans for further attempts. The Wikipedia article on this operation hints that allegedly the front part of the hull was recovered, including 2 intact nuclear torpedoes and the sonar dome, and that the part of the hull containing the nuclear-tipped missiles, code books, and cryptographic gear was lost due to the claw malfunction. It also hints that the claw malfunction story may have been a fabrication, and that all of the sought-after sensitive material had been recovered and covered up, presumably to preserve the advantage gained from its study. The remains of 6 Soviet submariners were also recovered and given a burial at sea in accordance with military convention. Story 3. The acoustic kitty is a pretty crazy concept. They basically put microphones and a radio in a cat and tried to release it into the Soviet embassy to wander around eavesdropping since nobody suspects a wandering cat. Story 4. The Pentagon Papers, which were leaked and not outright declassified, and the resultant Church Committee report made public the Central Intelligence Agency's actions in overthrowing governments and instigating or assisting coups all over the world for decades leading up to the 1970s. Pretty much every negative stereotype of the Central Intelligence Agency we have today was created or informed by the Pentagon Papers and Church Committee report. Story 5. Operation Sea Spray was a 1950 United States Navy secret biological warfare experiment in which Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii bacteria were sprayed over the San Francisco Bay Area in California, in order to determine how vulnerable a city like San Francisco might be to a bioweapon attack. Between 1949 and 1969, open-air tests of biological agents were conducted 239 times. In 80 of those experiments, the Army said it used live bacteria that its researchers at the time thought were harmless. Story 6. Psychological warfare in the Philippines in the 1950s comes to mind. The Central Intelligence Agency conducted research to figure out which sort of myths and superstitions the Philippine people had. They discovered that they were afraid of vampires. At one point, they disrupted a group by snatching a local man, murdering him, and putting teeth marks on his neck. They then hung him upside down for his friends to find, which terrified the village. This was all part of an effort to elect Ramon Magsaysay as president, who basically acted as a puppet for the United States. The Central Intelligence Agency wrote his speeches and directed his policy. Story 7. During the 1960s, the Central Intelligence Agency noticed that artists tended to lean towards socialism and communism. They realized the best way to prevent this or discredit these political positions was to make them wealthy, so they would be more invested in capitalism. To do this, the Central Intelligence Agency would anonymously buy modern art pieces, no matter how nonsensical, for very high prices. This made the otherwise highly niche and difficult to access modern art genre a chic, fashionable, and highly profitable genre and basically prevented prominent members of the art community from turning to socialism or communism by converting them into wealthy members of the upper class. The spoiled nouveau riche avant-garde airhead artist stereotype was literally created by the Central Intelligence Agency dumping money into prominent figures' pockets and allowing them to discredit their political activism by becoming self-indulgent parodies of themselves. Story 8. All the failed assassination attempts against Fidel Castro. According to Fabian Escalante, who worked for the Cuban counterintelligence, there were 638 of them. Here are some highlights. In 1960, they tried to poison his cigars. They asked the Chicago mob for help, and they said poison pills are the best. The mobsters hired a local assassin, who gave them to an ice cream parlor employee who was supposed to slip them into Castro's ice cream. When he tried to get the poison pills from the freezer, they were frozen solid on the coils of the freezer. They planned to put explosives under a painted seashell, as Castro loved to go scuba diving and collect seashells. The plan was discarded as impractical. In the same year, they contaminated a scuba diving suit for Castro with a fungus that should give Castro a deadly disease. The person tasked with this, American lawyer James Donovan, who was negotiating the release of hostages after the Bay of Pigs invasion, could not do it in the end. They trained his lover to poison him, but she got cold feet. They had a James Bond-like idea of poisoning him with a tiny needle attached to a ballpoint pen. The government official who was supposed to stab him with that needle threw the pen away, as he was too afraid that the needle might accidentally poison him instead. Last but not least, they had the idea to assassinate his character by spraying a hallucinogenic chemical into the broadcasting studio where he held his speeches. The idea was to make him look confused and unfit to rule. The plan was abandoned as the chemical was unreliable. Story 9. The Simple Sabotage Field Manual was created by the Office of Strategic Services, which was the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, before it was given that name. It served as a guide on how to enact simple sabotage in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. Interestingly, their guide on how managers can sabotage work sounds a lot like how some companies operate today. Demand written orders, misunderstand orders, ask endless questions or engage in lengthy correspondence about such orders. Quibble over them when you can. Do everything possible to delay the delivery of orders. Even if parts of an order are ready beforehand, don't deliver it until it is completely finished. Don't order new working materials until your current stock is nearly exhausted, so that the slightest delay in filling your order will cause a shutdown. Order high-quality materials that are difficult to obtain. If you don't get them, argue about it. Warn that inferior materials will result in inferior work. When making work assignments, always give out the unimportant jobs first. Ensure that the important jobs are assigned to inefficient workers with poor machines. Insist on perfect work in relatively unimportant products. Send back items for refinishing that have the slightest flaw. Approve other defective parts whose flaws are not visible to the naked eye. Make mistakes in routing so that parts and materials will be sent to the wrong place in the plant. When training new workers, give incomplete or misleading instructions. 10. To lower morale and, with it, production, be pleasant to inefficient workers. Give undeserved promotions. Discriminate against efficient workers. Complain unjustly about their work. 11. Hold conferences when there is more critical work to be done. Story 10. The pardon of the Japanese who ran Unit 731 in exchange for their findings. They performed countless experiments on live human prisoners of war, cutting off limbs to test blood loss, injecting them with diseases and observing how they progressed when left untreated, performing vivisections on these same individuals, and other extremely disturbing actions that I don't have the stomach to describe. You can search for more details online. The United States government felt it was more important to have that information in American hands than to let it go to the Russians or be lost. You would never be able to conduct those kinds of experiments again, and for good reason, so they considered it the lesser of two evils. Story 11. MKUltra, but unfortunately the only documents we got from it are from an off-site storage space that the officials in the Central Intelligence Agency forgot about. Also, the Central Intelligence Agency document that says the political structure of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics wasn't a one-man, one-rule, or the one talking about how Tibet was a feudal backwater. Story 12, related to the Central Intelligence Agency, there was the Strategic Services Simple Sabotage Field Manual Number 3 as a practical guide to sabotage. The manual gave clandestine officers a simple, effective method to sabotage industrial production, interfere with transportation and communications, and, most interestingly, degrade organizations' productivity from within. Some of my favorite tips. When possible, refer all matters to committees for further study and consideration. Attempt to make the committees as large as possible, never less than 5. Refer back to matters decided upon at the last meeting and attempt to reopen the question of the advisability of that decision. Haggle over precise wordings of communications, minutes, resolutions. Story 13. One of the craziest declassified Central Intelligence Agency documents is Operation Midnight Climax, where the Central Intelligence Agency dosed unsuspecting individuals with LSD as part of mind control experiments. It reads like a spy novel, but unfortunately, it's a disturbing chapter in history. Story 14. U.S. military advisors are saying that an armed conflict in Vietnam cannot be won due to the general sentiment and freedom movement they would fight. That the Vietnamese liberation movement would continue no matter what or who would actually end up leading it. Secondly, Nixon sabotaged and delayed peace talks in Vietnam so he could blame it as Lyndon B. Johnson's failure and win the election. Story 15. It's not American, but Operation Mincemeat on Netflix is pretty crazy and based on a true story. They faked war plans invading Greece and floated an already dead body from a submarine near a beach in Spain with the fake plans on the body, which they knew would get back to the Germans. It did. The Germans rearranged troops to prepare for an invasion of Greece, and the Allies walked into Sicily. Story 16, 100% the Gateway Experience. Like, this is absolutely bonkers. A declassified document from 1983 detailing the Central Intelligence Agency's usage of harmonic resonance to gain access to the astral plane. It describes how the agency used astral projection to create force fields around military bases, visit the future, and even talk to literal God. They call God the Absolute, which they claim is all of the universe compiled into a single point for a single moment in time, after which the universe re-expands. Seriously, read this if you have a mind for the creepy and unexplained. Story 17. Central Intelligence Agency Black Sites. Secret prisons where terrorist suspects were taken for interrogation, prison sentences, and possibly more. Some sites were in Europe, including Poland and Lithuania. Story 18. Operation Northwoods. Rejected by President John F. Kennedy in 1962, the plan was for the Central Intelligence Agency to stage and commit mass acts of terrorism against the United States that would have included hijackings and bombings across major U.S. cities. After these attacks were committed, the plan was to place the blame on Cuba to justify going to war with them. You can search this up yourself if you do not believe me. Story 19. MKUltra. Basically, McGill University in Montreal sent mental patients to the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, from the Royal Victoria Hospital. The CIA did all kinds of nightmarish tests on them. This was done in Montreal and only came out decades later. One of my friend's moms said for years that the CIA did horrible things to her, and everyone assumed she was just insane. Turned out she was right and lived all her life with no one believing her. Horrible stuff. Story 20. Not Central Intelligence Agency, but Federal Bureau of Investigation Counterintelligence Program. The origin operation of the infamous letter to Martin Luther King Jr. to convince him to commit suicide. Story 21. The craziest declassified Central Intelligence Agency documents are the ones written as red herrings for spies back in the Cold War, like the one that detailed their psychic experiments with remote viewing that granted the United States the capability to see anywhere at any point in time whenever they want by using Mars as a target and looking into the past to see a recent Martian civilization at various points in time. Story 22. Does only the United States Intelligence Agency declassify their documents? At this point, I'm familiar with most of it but have no idea about the KGB, MI6, and the Research and Analysis Wing. I'm not talking about rumors, but legitimate, declassified, confidential documents. It should be interesting to see what other Central Intelligence Agency counterparts were up to. Story 23. Operation Northwoods. The Department of Defense proposed that Central Intelligence Agency operatives plant bombs around the United States, commit terrorist acts, and blame them on Cuba. This was approved all the way up to, but not including, the president. Story 24. The papers describe astral projection. They brought a psychic in and placed an envelope with coordinates and a time frame on it. They asked him to describe what he saw. He described a dying planet where people had left to discover a new place they could populate. It was revealed that the envelope contained coordinates on Mars in the distant past. It goes much more in-depth where he describes large structures, etc. It's not very long and very much worth the read.